All right. So today our focus is on non-consumptive use of wildlife. These are ways that we use wildlife that does not involve killing them and using them up, but ways that we basically usually interact with them. So, any type of non-hunting or non-extractive use, so we don't remove them from their habitat, we don't kill them. Examples: feeding wildlife, do wildlife photography, bird watching, whale watching will be some examples that we talk about today, along with a bunch of others. So, since 1955, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has kind of conducted different surveys of numbers of people that fish, hunt, and do other type of wildlife recreation. And what they found was, in a sample of 85,000 households, very large numbers of people benefit from non-consumptive use of wildlife. Out of 100 million US residents, 16 years and older, over that many hunted or wildlife watched. Almost 30 million people fished. I'm not sure, this sort of feels like hunting to me, but maybe they're putting the fish back. Okay, 12.5 million hunted and 71.1 million participated in at least one type of wildlife watching, like observing, feeding, taking pictures of wildlife. In the 31% of the United States population said that they either fed, observed, or photographed wildlife in 2006. And that was a 13% increase from 10 years prior. So all these surveys were taken in 2006. So the number of fishing had gone down in that time period. The numbers of people hunting had gone down. The number of people photographing, feeding, observing, but not killing had gone up. So our interest in wildlife was changing a little bit as from use to entertainment. So in 2006, hunters and anglers spent about $75 billion accessing the fish and the animals that they would consume. Wildlife watchers spent $45 billion. So it's actually 1% of the US gross domestic product goes towards wildlife and tracking it, watching it, or hunting it. So there are some drawbacks to this non-consumptive use, and one of them has to do with interactions humans have with those animals. You can see here it's been in the news kind of regularly. Tourists getting gored in Yellowstone when they don't follow the rules and they get too close to their wildlife viewing. Um, See here, fifth bison goring occurring in Yellowstone National Park. Human wildlife conflict, which we've talked about before, human and wildlife interacting. We're going to talk a little bit about how they can alter the animal behavior, how there can really be some problems with feeding animals, and also animals can become stressed out by us forcing interaction with them. I thought it was interesting they included this article. This is actually about a University of Washington medical school professor who was killed by a crocodile in Africa. And I actually remember reading this article when this happened. But he had moved to Africa to do medical work and train doctors because he was a doctor. And while in a canoe or kayak, I believe, he was killed by drugged from out by a crocodile in front of his wife. That's a bummer. But there's all types of examples of people who have died whale watching, on safari, etc. So as we're going out and trying to observe some of these dangerous wildlife, there's a potential drawback for humans in that as well. So humans and animals can get too comfortable. The idea that, oh, well, we're just going to go visit the crocodiles, and you kind of forget, well, we're going to visit a dangerous animal. When people do that over time and it kind of becomes normalized, people are less vigilant, and accidents are more likely to happen. You always want to make sure you are respectful of the wildlife you are observing, constantly aware of your surroundings, because you observing them can cause animals to act differently that can put you in danger. So that's how we get to the altered animal behavior. And so one major issue that's happened in the last 20 years is a huge increase in ecotourism. And studies have shown that ecotourism can actually increase predation of animals on humans. And the more direct way is through habituation. If humans feed them, animals get used to getting food, then they get more aggressive for their food, they become bolder, and then their behavior can cause danger to future humans. and sometimes even just the presence of humans near animals. If they've had tons and tons of interactions or presence of humans without having a negative interaction, they might get closer and closer to humans, and at one point they might get bold and attack one of those humans. The other thing that happens is with the humans kind of being somewhere, certain predators will move away who don't like that having that interaction. Humans become less vigilant, and then that predator can sneak up on them as well. So it can happen in both ways. So, feeding wildlife. Kind of fun to kind of feed a wild animal and get to watch them eat, kind of attract them a little bit closer. A lot of potential negatives. If animals learn that humans are cheap and easy food, they will lose their fear of humans. They can associate people with food. They can become a danger or a pest, like bears and trash cans. And they can also lose their natural foraging behaviors and become dependent on humans. And then it creates that cycle to increase. Um, it used to be very common that people would feed wildlife from vehicles. At one point in Yosemite, it was actually encouraged. This obviously causes traffic hazards, can be property damage, injury. People can be injured by wildlife. Wildlife can be injured by vehicles. So obviously, equating moving cars with food is a dangerous solution. Oh, it's one of those hairless snack machines. I hope it has granola bars. Kind of funny. Russian grizzlies have become a hazard in motorways when they wander across the freeways. They stop traffic and approach cars looking for food. The drivers have been feeding them in these remote areas where it isn't limited. Police fear that if they unwind their car windows, the animals will attack them. More cars are being damaged as bears are getting tracked in vehicles looking for food. The interior of a car can just be completely demolished from a panicked bear that all of a sudden gets shut inside a door and doesn't know how to use the handle. Wildlife like move into waste where we deposit waste, and this can be a real problem. You see, they're already here at the dump, and somebody's just handing them his trash bag to go through. As they do that, when they don't find adequate foods, then they move on to cars and other places where humans frequent. Here is a car that had a interaction with a grizzly and came out on the wrong end. Here's the interior of a car where a grizzly got trapped. So, feeding wildlife. Besides the fact that they get comfortable and aggressive and can cause damage, it can also be at risk themselves. As we feed more and more wildlife, they congregate in larger numbers. That can cause a spread of disease. If animals wouldn't normally congregate in such numbers, it can be a nuisance. Depending on the animal, it can attract more predators. Also, the food people choose to feed animals isn't usually their natural food source and isn't good for them. It might smell good, but it isn't always healthy for them, and can lead to them to continue to interact with humans and cause conflict. So it became a really big issue. And in 1969, this book was written after a fatality from grizzly bears, and officially the practice of feeding the bears was stopped. You might feed wildlife in your own backyard. Bird feeders are really fun. This cat is enjoying its bird feeder. Backyard wildlife feeding has pros and cons. If you do it right and you keep it clean and dry and all of those things, it's not a problem. But if it gets wet in there and it molds, it can be unhealthy for the birds. It also provides entertainment for the cat as long as the cat is an indoor cat. It can increase predation. If there's a outdoor cat and bird feeders nearby, they know where to watch for their next prey. This made me laugh. Attention all Arctic ground squirrels. Warning, refuse all handouts from humans. They mean well, but their food will make you slow and fat. Easy bear bait. Revert to natural foods for your own survival. Do not accept human handouts. A funny way of trying to tell humans you're not helping these animals when you're feeding them. I've never seen anything like this, but I've always heard about people who can go places where you feed the dolphins. And from this case study in Shark Bay in Australia, the message was very clear: don't feed the dolphins too much. In this bay, there's about 2,700 dolphins that kind of live in this area. And in the 1960s on, people started handing food to the dolphins and enjoying those interactions. It became a very popular place to visit. Also, with all those dolphins interacting, it's been one of the longest research projects for dolphins to learn more about them. So over the course of time, there's been that 2,700. The population now is roughly about 200 individuals that live in that area. And what they found was it started off with humans feeding small numbers of dolphins, three families that were all female that would come into that beach. It started because the dolphins had learned to beg from boats to get scraps off boats. Anglers would feed just the extra scraps to the dolphins, which they figured was no problem. But the dolphins really liked that idea, so then they'd come in and find more humans and beg for food. And at first, the feeding was a free for all. People just fed whatever they had, however much they had, not necessarily food that was good for them. What scientists found, because they were doing research as well, is first of all, baby dolphins, the calves, they nurse from their mothers, and then around 3 to 4 months of age, they start catching fish on their own. Calves really learn how to do that by observing their mothers, and they typically wean when they're about 4 years old, but they start that fish diet when they're 3 to 4 months old. Well, in 1987 to 1994, the females that were being fed from people on the shore lost most of their baby calves. They weren't surviving like they normally did. And so scientists wanted to figure out why. Well, possibilities: mothers were spending too much time interacting with the tourists and not teaching their young how to forage. If the babies can't watch the mothers hunt, then they're not going to learn how. They needed to learn that behavior. Also, there was a possibility that there was disease from human contact or a change in diet if the humans weren't feeding them what they would have been feeding on naturally in their habitat. And also, if there's a bunch of dolphins always in one spot, a high density of them with regularity, there could have been a high density of predators kind of off the shore waiting for the dolphins to come into open water. So other signs that feeding the dolphins wasn't very good. Scientists noticed that an 18-month-old calf was beach dependent. It couldn't go out and hunt on its own at all. It was very emaciated and underfed, and it ended up dying. It didn't have any of the natural foraging behavior. When it was hungry, it would just go beg from boats instead of go catch a fish. It hadn't learned the correct behaviors that it needed. Another example is they witnessed a calf get killed by a tiger shark while its mother was in the bay begging for fish from tourists. That calf as well was underfed and not healthy from having learned healthy behaviors and actions. So in 1995, based on what they were seeing, the Western Australia Department of Environment Conservation implemented new rules. They would only have 3 feedings per day, and they would not feed babies. They only would allow dolphins to be fed fish that were found locally in the area that would have been part of their natural diet, and they only allowed each dolphin to be fed a quarter of the amount of food it would need per day. This way, the mother dolphins would spend the rest of their day fishing for the 75% of the food they needed to fill their diet, and their babies would be hungry from not being fed by people, and they would follow the mother's lead and learn how to fish for themselves. So the department ended up managing the feedings. They would pick just 1 or 2 tourists from the crowd who let them feed them, provide instructions, make sure that the dolphins weren't hurt and they're fed the right items. So instead of just a free-for-all, anyone can come down and feed them, it was more of a show, and a couple people could interact and everybody could watch. So this kept the tourists happy, and it kept the local people who were making money off this tourism happy, and it also helped the populations of the local dolphins. After doing that, reproduction numbers went back to normal. The next year, once they started implementing this, 6 out of 6 calves survived. So we had very good improvement from limiting the interaction without having to stop it completely. Another example is the Bahamian rock iguanas. Iguanas were being fed by tourists. Again, they weren't very wary, and they were more friendly and just out in the open trying to get attention, so they were more vulnerable to predators. They also found that by doing this and coming out where the humans are, these iguanas ingested more trash. They ate a lot more foods that weren't native to their environment, what they would have naturally been eating. And they were eating a lot of sand due to people dropping the food on the sand and then picking up and eating it. So they weren't usually eating on sandy beaches. And so just moving that location integrated that sand into their diet, which wasn't a natural, healthy a way for them to eat. Komodo dragon feedings, in order to fix this problem, were discontinued. And what they saw was when they stopped feeding the Komodo dragons and the iguanas, the natural foraging behaviors returned, and they were able to kind of return to those normal behaviors. If they get fed, they're not going to go looking for food, but when they weren't fed, they returned to that behavior. Instead of having an iguana feeding station in Turks and Caicos, they transformed it into a non-feeding walking tour with educational signage. So you could still see them in their habitat, but they weren't going to continue to feed them anymore. Other examples like grizzly bears going into trash, when we just remove garbage pits that they work in or that they would go forage in, they were no longer staying around the chalets where all the humans were. So when we take care of some of those temptations, the animals return to natural behaviors. So ecotourism is a big topic. The idea behind ecotourism is it's responsible travel to natural areas to conserve the environment and help the people who there locally. And it's been growing for years. And the question is ecotourism always good? I know someone I think is thinking about writing their paper on that topic. So the idea behind ecotourism is good. It's to minimize the impact on the environment, build environmental and cultural awareness and respect, provide positive experiences for visitors and their hosts, provide the local people financial benefits to conserve. So the people aren't going to want to cut down forests to farm if they're getting paid to have the natural habitat there for the natural animals. And then to raise sensitivity to the host country's political environment and social climate. The idea here is that ecotourists will pay a lot of money for the opportunity. It supplements the traditional funding for conservation, which isn't usually enough. Ecotourists usually are wildlife watchers. They'll invest more in the local economy than other tourists coming in. They'll put the money right where they need it. They'll want to spend their time where the wildlife is, so those actual communities right there will benefit. And it will create an interest in the environment and in wildlife, and in general, then spread a message of wildlife conservation. So, wildlife watching is definitely one of the biggest, most popular forms of ecotourism. Bird watching trips, whale watching trips, wildlife safaris. There's not necessarily interaction so much as observation. There are some potential downfalls, though, if ecotourism isn't done correctly. And even if it is, there's something to be said for numbers. So, animals that are being watched, depending on what animal it is and how sensitive they are to different disturbances, might alter their feeding patterns if people are there. Presence of people can increase stress. Here we can see manatees by a boat. So most manatees in the wild have scars on their backs from interactions with propellers. So boat wildlife collisions can injure the animals. It can flip the boats. It can cause wildlife to attack. Um, Communication sometimes changes with wildlife when there's loud boats and stuff in the area. Animals will be quieter. If there's a helicopter flying in to get to a bird watching spot, it can disturb the birds. Um, when you are kind of infiltrating these areas where animals were kind of off on their own, it can introduce non-native species. Making more roads and facilities can disturb the environment and change sort of the habitat and area for animals. It can increase pollution. It can degrade the habitat if not done correctly. So, how does this all fit in with our discussion about whether animals are as dangerous as we perceive? Well, as we make it comfortable and easy for us to access, we kind of lower our guard and then may not remember that these are wild animals and they need to keep their distance. So they did a study about dolphin watching. Here, I'm not exactly even sure where Monkey Mia is, but in 1993 they had their first commercial dolphin watching boat. In 1998 they put a second boat in this area, and they wanted to look at the dolphin numbers and whether they were impacted by the presence of one boat, two boats, more boats. So, what would you guess? Well, what they found was one tour boat had essentially no effect on the number of dolphins living in the area. The dolphins were here before there was a tour boat, and when there was a tour boat, they really saw no noticeable impact. As soon as they added a second tour boat in the same area, they saw the dolphin populations drop, as you see in this solid number. What's interesting is in a different area where the tour boats weren't, the population rose. So it sort of appears that the animals that were living here that were bothered by the boats moved to a different location. So they noticed that there was a negative impact just by having an extra boat there to observe the animals affected the wildlife there. Another example is harbor seal viewing. There's a lot of places where you can go and see harbor seals in areas where they come in to either to eat, but also to rest. Oftentimes when they're in bays, they're in there for protection from predators. They're in there for calmer water for resting, and so that they can get up on the rocks on the shore to actually rest and warm up in the sun. So what they found is that harbor seals were very sensitive to any type of boat traffic. They're very vigilant, and they would haul out in large groups to rest, numbers and safety in numbers, but they were worrying that human interaction were causing them to haul out of the water at different times or different locations to avoid human disturbances. Some concerns about that is it could disrupt nursing patterns for young pups. It could disrupt their ability to get a good rest. Some mothers might even get startled and abandon their young pups and not get reunited. So a lot of concerns about them being very sensitive animals and needing this resting time. And so they also looked at the impact on these animals from different vehicles, and to see what disturbed them and caused their behaviors to change and what didn't. And something that's interesting is they compared how they react to kayaks and how they react to vessels, like larger boats. And what they found is kayaks would get a lot closer and were quieter. And so they were actually more hesitant and more aware of the kayak kind of sneaking up on them and getting closer. And so kayaks actually had a bigger impact of disturbances than other ships did. So you can see here is when there were a lot of kayaks, and here there's a lot of disturbances from kayaks. And by 2011, when they stopped having kayaks, there was way fewer disturbances in general than these other years. Here's an example in Masai Mara, where for ecotourism, they constructed a new lodge with temporary tents. This is an area of Africa that has huge migration patterns and is very important for a lot of different animals migrating across. So obviously it's a spot where if you put some ecotourism, you can see some really cool animals. The problem is this was not a government conservation regulated ecotourism. This is an example of the bad choice. And they actually constructed their housing on black rhino breeding ground. Didn't have the proper permits, had a lot of negative impacts to the wildlife, which is the exact opposite of what ecotourism is supposed to be. So when people book, they need to be very aware that you're using a reputable company that's doing everything right to actually help with conservation and keep habitats strong and safe and population numbers safe. But in Kenya, tourism is the number 2 most important industry. People coming and wanting to go on safari and seeing the animals is huge industry. So the number of lodges are expanding because that's where the money is. Like I said, it's the area where the annual migration happens. It's one of the best reserves in Africa, but the more and more lodges, we can obviously imagine you have to be very careful to not cause more harm than help. So until 2002, there was actually no kind of check and balances for ecotourism. People could just call it that and then make some money. So they started a process, still kind of vague, but they had started having levels of how good it was for conservation and animals and protecting against habitat degradation and things like that. So it's an improvement in the right direction. One thing that you can't use to figure out which one is official and which one is not is you can't necessarily look at the price per person or customer satisfaction or even the amenities. Here's an example of a bush breakfast where they set up the tables just in the middle of the African bush, the safaris. Um, Hopefully the ones that are doing well are going to be more socially responsible. This is an example of an ecotourism group that helps provide clean water for the local people. You want to have ones that are using solar power whenever possible, organic foods and organic production of foods nearby, sustainable water practices. All of those would be a good sign of a good ecotourism group. But what they found in looking at a bunch of different options is there really wasn't a difference in price or satisfaction or what they claimed for sustainability. Um, so there was not a lot of transparency. You couldn't, before they started labeling them, figure out which ones were good and which ones were bad, hence the need for that organization. So there was no difference, like I said, in the price or in the amenities necessarily between a good ecotourism and a bad, but there was very big differences in whether it was sustainable or not. And some customer satisfaction therefore could change as well. So we were talking about wildlife watching. With ecotourism, it's a rapidly developing business where people can go and watch. They looked at 251 different case studies and found that some of them were very sustainable, some were not. Scientists looked at different trends to figure out what makes it a good ecotourism operation and what makes it a bad one. Habitat was studied, species that were there. Is the local community involved? If the answer is no, it's probably not a good sustainable system. Um, and so that was a big one that they looked at. So again, it's unsustainable if the ecotourism causes an alteration in habitat or soil erosion, pollution. If the local community isn't involved, that's going to be a problem. It's usually going to lead to consumptive land use. If the flag species are affected or if populations of species decline, this probably isn't a good system. And oftentimes, the ones that are not monitored aren't necessarily bad in their setup, but they might be allowing too many tourists, which can have a huge impact in the unsustainability. Or they might not be using the local community. They might not have enough control and management. They might not have enough of a protected area, and they might not have enough of an environmental education to really know what they're doing. So for ecotourism to work, there needs to be a lot of transparency. The money has to go directly to the people who live locally in that area, and there needs to be cooperation from the local communities and enforcement, law enforcement, or different conservation groups enforcing the rules. So non-consumptive use of wildlife, it can be harmful to animals if it's not managed carefully. One of the biggest challenges is there's competition between operators. Like we saw, if there's smaller numbers of people, it's sustainable. As the numbers grow, it's not. If one company is doing well, obviously another company is going to want to come in and do well, and that's where it can go from sustainable to not so much. So management practices need to be based on scientific data, and when they are, we've seen effective changes, like we saw with the Komodo dragons going from being fed to not fed, but there's a walkway where you can see them, and it changed the health and the wellness of those animals. All right, that's it for this lesson. I hope you all are doing well.